Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Microeconomics. So today we are jumping into chapter 4 to talk about how we're going to measure welfare in our supply-demand model and also talk about a little of the government policy tools to fix some market failure problems. So in this chapter, we are basically going further study on top of what we did in chapter 3. From our basic supply-demand model, we combine the supply and demand in single market, and we find that there is always a equilibrium that the market will converge to. Now we would like to actually evaluate how we are going to measure the efficiency, or what we call social welfare, from the market. We want to actually investigate whether the equilibrium yields the highest welfare in the market for both the supplier and the consumers. And then we will talk about some of the topics that causing a market failure. That means, well, when the market is not functioning efficiently. And at the end of this chapter, we would like to also talk about some policy discussions. And we would like to use a very popular forms of policy called price control policy to demonstrate how sometimes the government policy might affect the efficiency of the market. And of course, we would like to also investigate how the government is using those tools to achieve some of the policy goals. So from chapter 3, we learned that the markets will be operating at the equilibrium levels. Even though when we are not at the equilibrium, we know there is always an automatic driving force, or sometimes the economist says there is an invisible hand to force the market towards the equilibrium. But we want to actually try to find out more from the model today. So we would like to find a way to measure how the efficiency is being captured by the market's transactions. And we call this a allocative efficiency. And we also want to find out how we can maximize this efficiency in our society in the forms of market structure. And of course, at the end, we would like to discuss some of the government interventions, how they can affect the efficiency in the society, and what are the policy goals they might try to achieve. Well, first, we need to find a correct measure on our efficiency units. Well, in the study of economics, we always try to refer our efficiency in terms of dollar. But in fact, well, it's not limited to just measuring efficiency in the units of dollar or maybe in terms of value of the goods. But it's just make it a little bit easier. It just make it easier to quantify, and it just make it easier for us to conceptualize it. And therefore, today we are going to introduce the two forms of efficiency or welfare in the market setting. One is called the consumer surplus, the other one called producer surplus. And please don't misunderstand this surplus with the market surplus that we talk about in chapter 3. So what is a consumer surplus? So consumer surplus basically refer to the benefit received by the buyers in the markets. And in general, we basically assume every buyer has a set of prices they would like to purchase the good in the market. So consumer will automatically evaluate the needs of the goods and also the value, right? How much the goods actually worth in their life. And once they put the price in their head, well, they will go to the market to search if they find anything that match with this price or even have a lower price offer in the markets. Well, consumer surplus refer to the price that the buyer actually pay in the market and the price that they are willing to pay, or sometimes we call the maximum willingness to pay on that particular goods or service. So to calculate that in a single transaction, it's not too bad. we basically just say there is a maximum buying price in every head of the buyer, and we use that price to subtract the price that the buyer actually paid. And the difference between the two will be turned into what we call the consumer surplus in the market. Given a simple example, if you think the apple in Trader Joe's actually worth $1, and you go to Trader Joe's, but Trader Joe's only offer the apple at a price of 50 cents. And you will think that, hey, my maximum buying price is $1, but I'm actually paying 50 cents for the apple. So therefore, $1 minus 50 cents, your consumer surplus in these transactions will be 50 cents additionals that you're saving. Well, the producer surplus, on the other hand, is the reverse case of the consumer surplus. In the producer surplus case, we basically study how much the firm or the supplier are willing to sell the products at the lowest price possible. Well, usually we refer to the lowest price they are willing to sell the goods or service to the cost of the productions. So every time when the firm produces something, they have to pay a cost. And when they are trying to sell those units out in the market, they have to at least cover the cost. So therefore, the producer surplus basically captures the price that the seller actually receives from the market by selling the product, minus the minimum selling price they are willing to accept to sell the products in the market. And sometimes we refer this to the minimum willingness to sell. So the producer surplus use the price that the firm received minus the minimum willingness to sell, and that means whenever there is a difference between how much the firm planning to sell the product or willing to accept to sell the product in the market, but they receive more than that, then they will receive some benefits. Well, in a very simple case, for example, Trader Joe's, they actually sell you the apple at a price of 50 cents, but they actually receive those apples from farmers at a cost of 20 cents. So 20 cents is what they are willing to accept in order to retrieve the cost for selling the apple in store. If they can sell the apple at a price of 50 cents, that means for every apple they sell, they actually earn 30 additional cents of profits. And that's basically what we refer to the producer surplus. But now we have a concept about consumer surplus and producer surplus. You can try to see if this example actually relates to the actual conditions. Let's suppose you are trying to buy a Nintendo Switch from with a budget of $400. You're planning to buy the Switch by paying the maximum price of $400. When you get to Target and you find out they are doing a promotions and the final price for the unit is $350. So in this case, your consumer surplus, it's basically $400, the maximum willingness to pay, minus the actual price you're paying, $350. So it has a net of $50, and that's the benefit you as a consumer receive. Well, in the same transactions, if Target is willing to sell the Nintendo Switch at a cost of $200 to cover, and they are actually selling the unit at a price of $350 and you bought it. So this time, the producer actually received, well, that means Target actually received $350 from you, and netting the cost, they bring in the units to the store, which is $200, and Target, in this case, will earn $150 of profit. And as you can see, in this one single transactions, both the consumers and the producers actually earn additional benefits. Remember, in Chapter 2, we talk about how we can always gain from trading. And this is a perfect example to demonstrate that. Well, now we have an example to demonstrate how we calculate the consumer surplus and producer surplus. And let's just sum it up. Whenever we are talking about the surplus overall in the markets, we actually refer to the benefits received from the society when they are trading in that one single market. So remember, we have millions of people trading every single second in the world. if we talk about a single market, we want to measure the benefits that people actually received from this one single market. Well, we can actually capture all these different transactions. Every single transactions, consumer will earn something and the producer will earn something. And therefore, the combinations of the two, when we're adding the consumer surplus and the producer surplus from the market, we can actually call this a total surplus. And this term, total surplus, always refer to the social welfare received by the consumers and the producers in a single market. Well, in our previous example, remember, we have the total surplus of summing from the targets and the consumers, which is $50 plus $150, and that's add up to $200 total in that particular one transaction case. So when we talk about the surplus or welfare, it's easy to do it in a single transaction case. However, remember when we talk about a whole market transactions, right? So from the month of March, right? From the 1st to the 31st in March, there are so many transactions could happen every single day or maybe every single hours. So how are we going to capture all of this welfare? Well, conceptually, we can actually use and apply our supply-demand model to help making these measurements a little bit easier on the graphical models. So this is basically the reason why we have the supply-demand curve graphs presented here in this slide. We would like to capture what we call the consumer surplus in the market, and we can literally just make some assumptions. Number one, we assume that everyone standing on the demand curve, they are basically ranked by the maximum price they are willing to pay for this particular product. And on the supply curve, those are the firms that they have the minimum willingness to sell and ranking by how much they are willing to sell their product in the market. So how much the consumer will need to pay and how much the producer will be receiving by selling those units in the market? Well, that depends on the equilibrium. Remember, the equilibrium price will tell you how much the consumer and the producer will pay and received in the market. So if we look at this graph right here, you can literally imagine there are so many people standing on the demand curve. Many of them actually think the product actually worth at least $40 or above. Right? So there are so many people standing on the demand curve that actually above the $40 price point. And they will think those are the people who think it's worth to buy the product at a price of $40. And they will keep buying and buying and buying and buying. And demand showing the maximum willingness to pay, while the equilibrium price showing how much they are actually paying. And therefore, this yellow triangle actually represents the consumer surplus in the market. On the other hand, if you take a look at the producer surplus side, we have all the firms and producers, they are willing to sell the product at a price that at least covering the cost, which is represented by the supply curve. And they are actually receiving $40 for each transaction they make in the market. So what is the total benefit received by the producer in this case? Well, which is the orange color triangle. In order to calculate the total surplus received by a single market, now we can take a look at the total size of the two triangles. By adding the consumer surplus and the producer surplus in this one single graph, it helps us to actually capture the total surplus received by the single markets in this one single model. But something that we have to keep in mind, even though we talk about in chapter 3, markets usually will towards equilibrium because there is an invisible hand to force the market toward that equilibrium. But that is not always the case. That means, well, generally speaking, we can assume market operating under all the assumptions we make perfect information, many buyer and many seller, no one side actually taking over or dominating the markets, usually the market will towards the equilibrium. But if some of these assumptions actually failed, it's very easy that the market might not go towards the equilibrium. Specifically, we can use this example here to demonstrate. Let's suppose we have a market that it's not at the equilibrium, and for this market of mango smoothie, we know the price of mango smoothie is now charging at $7. Well, which is much more expensive than what the equilibrium price suggested in this model. If we are going to capture the consumer surplus in this case, we look at the demand curve. Anything that it's under the demand curve and above the market price, which is $7, the area of this green triangle, it's used to present the consumer surplus in the market. Now, for the producer surplus, we are basically looking at any area above the supply curve and under the market price, which is $7, which is this yellow trapezoid. So we have now the consumer surplus and the producer surplus represented in the graph. We know people will not buy more than 20 units of mango smoothie in this market. Producer, they will not be able to sell more than 20 units because it's too expensive. People are not buying that many. And that left with this little triangle that we have included before. This red triangle right here that we present in the graph basically is what we refer to the deadweight loss. So deadweight loss, it's basically the loss of the welfare in the markets when the market is not at equilibrium. So when deadweight loss actually appear in the market, that basically demonstrates the market is not operating in a very efficient level. Some of this benefit is not being captured by either the consumer or the producers. So this is the forms of losses that we do not like to see in our supply-demand model. As an economist, of course, when deadweight loss happens, or when deadweight loss actually appear in our model, we are trying to understand what drive the losses and how we can eliminate those losses in order to increase the welfare of the markets. So if we are trying to ask the questions, what drive the deadweight loss in the market? So the main reason why we have deadweight loss in a market, it's basically coming from the fact that we have lost the total number of transactions that could potentially and possible in the market. So again, refer to what we learned in chapter 2. There is always a gain from trading in any single transactions. So in the previous example, we learned that if the price is not at the equilibrium level, well, some of these possible transactions are being eliminated. And because we're eliminating those transactions in the market, and it prevents people, for example, like consumers and the producers, to make trade with each other in order to gain from these transactions in the market. Well, market failure, it's basically the main reason why we have deadweight loss. Well, in general, there are 4 main types of market failure situations. So that means, well, those are the 4 types of problems that causing the market not towards the equilibrium naturally. Number 1, lack of competitions. When we have a market that just does not have the competitions to drive the most efficient results, let's say firm in a single market that can dominate the market, for example, like Apple, right, or Google, or Facebook, where those giant companies could dominate the market and they can take so much power and they can charge any price of their goods in the markets to drive their profits. Well, those are the scenario where we don't see the market would go towards equilibrium because, well, one side of the market actually taking the decisions on their own. And number two, information is not shared by all parties. So lack of perfect information is another reason why the market will fail. So you can simply think about a case where you are buying a second-hand car, right? So when you purchase a second-hand car, well, the seller will always tell you, hey, this is a good car. It has a good conditions. But is it really true? Well, you will not be able to find out because you are not technicians and you do not have the knowledge to check the car. So in many cases, you might be purchasing a car that you think worked well and paying the price for it, but at the end, it might not be the car that you are thinking you're buying. So you're paying too high of a price in the market for that particular product. And number three, the existence of external benefit or costs. So that is another reason, very often the case, we might be overpaying the product or maybe underpaying the product. So whenever a transaction happens, but then not only the buyer and the seller receive the benefits or paying the cost of that product, someone else in the society might sharing those benefits or maybe need to share those costs, and during those transactions no one recognizes it. Again, we might be underpaying or overpaying that product. And number four, the existence of public goods. So there are many goods out there that might be considered to be a public goods, and we should actually have more of them to share in the society. For example, like educations. So if we are not funding enough for those public goods, we are not actually allocating enough resources to produce those public goods in the society. Again, we might have another market failure conditions. Well, some of this topic we will come back and discuss, especially the lack of competitions and also the external benefit and cost in the later chapters. But for now, we are basically just saying there are some situations where the market might not go towards the equilibrium naturally. And finally, whenever we are trying to think about efficiency, remember in chapter 1 we talk about there is always a trade-off between efficiency in the market and the equity in the markets. So one of the key reasons why we are studying efficiency today in this chapter, it's because we want to find out how we can maximize the efficiency in the markets. And obviously, the answer is when the market operating under a equilibrium conditions. Because whenever the market is not at equilibrium, it will automatically saying that there will be a deadweight loss. Because, well, when we are not operating in at the equilibrium, the total number of transactions will always be less than the equilibrium case. And therefore, the most efficient conditions will be at the equilibrium. However, we always talk about, even though we are operating the market at the most efficient level, right? We're operating the market very effectively, everyone gaining benefits. But we can imagine some of these people might also need those goods and services, and they just might not have the resources or may not have the ability to pay for it. Like for example, we always talk about healthcare insurance, right? In the United States, healthcare insurance has been a big topic. Should everyone have healthcare insurance cover? Should everyone purchase one? Should the government provide them? Should we have the government subsidize? So we always have these discussions. And obviously, health insurance is the most essential need from like any perspective. We have to have everyone get the equal chance to access the healthcare services in the United States. And therefore, should we depend on the market efficiency to run and letting some people who cannot afford it and just not buying it? So obviously the answer is no. So if we want to provide a equal solutions, right, equity solutions, we have to sacrifice some of the efficiency, and therefore the government might need to take control. They have to interfere the markets in order to provide that equity into our society. So in the next video, we are going to start discussing how the government will be using a policy tool called price control in order to make adjustments of the market so that they can actually achieve some of this political equity objective in a free market. And we are going to also see how we are going to give up some efficiency to get that solutions. All right, so I'm looking forward to see you guys next time. Have a great day.